Now that we've gone over the basics of how to make a Django website load HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we're going to be talking about the interesting parts of a dynamic website, namely databases. This is the way that we can actually store data, receive data from the users, and process that data. It'll allow you to make websites that are really interesting and also actually useful. So that sounds like good things, so let's actually get into it. So this video is just going to be about an introduction to what databases are, and try to give you some idea of the key terminology. So the way that we do that is let's just talk about the word SQL. So a lot of people have heard SQL, so let's look up what it means. SQL. Standard Structured Query Language. Oh, that's interesting. I've been telling everyone that it stands for Standard Query Language, but Structured Query Language, Standard Query Language, it's all the same. Basically what SQL is a way to, it's a specific way for databases to operate. Think about it like a template, and then various different database management systems implement it. So for instance, you might have heard of MySQL. This is a database management system, which means that we would have a MySQL database which uses the structured query language to interact with it. There's also databases like PostgreSQL, and this apparently is the world's most advanced open source database, but it also uses the SQL to interact with it. Now, there's other types of databases that don't use SQL. So for instance, there's MongoDB. MongoDB is what we call a NoSQL database. What this means is that it doesn't subscribe to the standard structured or the structured query language. But the thing is that it's a little bit different, and that's okay, but it has a specific places where it'd be useful. For the purposes of this website and also for this guide, we're going to be using SQL databases. More specifically, the database that Django comes with is something called SQLite. So you might have noticed inside of your application a SQLite file. SQLite is essentially a database which runs on SQL, but it's simply just within a file. Normally a database is something which runs on its own server and you make requests to, but SQLite is really lightweight and gets a lot of the nice benefits of SQL, so it's good for this purpose for a simple web app. Okay, so let's talk about what SQL actually is. So it's the structured query language, and that pretty much describes it. The way that SQL operates is you have these concepts of tables. So think about it like a bunch of Excel spreadsheets. So for instance, this right here would be the employee table. And for each table, you define some columns or attributes. So here we have employee ID, we have first name, last name, and salary. So these all also have to define specific types. So the ID would be an integer. The first name would be a character string of length 30 or less. Same thing for the last name, and the salary would be an integer. We can also define things like a time field. We can define a date field. We can define all sorts of things, but they have to be just specific types. So we have a tables, and then every time we want to store something, we add an entry to that table. So for instance, one Bob Smith 80,000 or 8,000, whatever that is an entry or what we call a row inside of the employee table. If we wanted to make another entry, we'd add another row. Every table entry has to have a unique identifier, or what we call a primary key. So in Django, every row will automatically be given a unique ID, but in this situation, notice how employee ID is the unique thing, because we need to be able to quickly find exactly which one we're talking about. And so if I want to look up something from the table, I'm basically asking for a specific row or a specific set of rows that meet a certain criterion if we're filtering on something. So that's how we define a table. So in a database, let's say we had a database for our company. We'd have a table for employees. We'd also have a table, let's say for, let's say for purchases that the company has made. So that would be its own separate table with its own set of columns, so on and so forth. So this basically is all that you need to know to really understand the way SQL works. Because Django uses something called an ORM, which stands for ORM database, let's see. object relational mapping, because it uses that, um, it allows us to essentially not have to write real SQL, but basically interface with the database through Python, which is really nice. In the next video, we're going to be talking about how do we actually create connections between the tables. Because let's say there was the purchase table and the employee table, but a specific employee made each of the purchases. So we want to know which employee made it. We'd have to make a link between those two tables. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next video.